Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence event series, brought to you by the Johns Hopkins University Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis and the Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features Dr. Maria Robson Morrow and Mr. Louis Sage-Passant discussing intelligence analysis for the private sector. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note today's program will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the MS in Intelligence Analysis playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the event to the host of our program, Dr. Michael Ard.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our program, Inside Intelligence. I'm Michael Ard. I'm the program director for the Master of Science of Intelligence Analysis at Johns Hopkins University. Today, we'll be looking at the growth, the importance of private sector intelligence analysis. So what is private sector intelligence? How significant is it? Is this an area for new intelligence innovation? What can traditional government intelligence learn from it? We have a very good group today to discuss that, Maria Robson Morrow and Louis Sage-Passant. Let me introduce them. Dr. Maria Robson Morrow teaches research methods in our program, the MS in Intelligence Analysis here at Johns Hopkins. She also works as Intelligence Project Program Coordinator at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. From 2012 to 2017, she worked as Security Intelligence Analyst in the energy sector in her home country of Canada. Dr. Robson Morrow holds a PhD in political science from Northeastern University, where she studied public and private sector intelligence cooperation. She also has been published in Intelligence and National Security, the Journal of Intelligence History, and the Harvard Business Review. Louis Sage-Passant is a doctoral researcher at the University of Loughborough, where he studies the history and present structure, sources, and methods of private sector intelligence teams. In his professional life, Sage-Passant is manager of global strategic intelligence at the US technology firm Salesforce, where he helps provide guidance on global geopolitical and security developments. Prior to this, Sage-Passant has worked in travel and tourism, financial services, the energy sector, as well as deploying to Afghanistan as a military intelligence officer. So welcome, Maria, Louis, and it's Loughborough. I know, I blew it. Anyway, but I'm glad to have you both here. This should be a great discussion. This is a fascinating topic. I'm very interested in it, of course, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say on it. I think we're going to start with Louis.
Thanks very much, Michael. I'm really happy to be here. So I think the key thing to start off with in any discussion about private sector intelligence is what are we really talking about? And we were joking just before we joined the call that we kind of expect half the room to disappear once we give our definition and realize they're sat in the wrong room. But I think this is a really important one because intelligence is a field that's still really grappling with definitions. It's still even the word intelligence is still being heavily debated. So when you start drilling down to things like private sector intelligence, it's even less well understood. So really what we're talking about today is we use an audience-centric definition. The idea of the audience that's receiving the intelligence is what defines it. So intelligence being done for the private sector is really the topic today. A lot of people, when they hear the word private sector intelligence, they immediately think we're talking about government contracting or elements of government intelligence that are being outsourced to different companies. And that's really not the case. So rather than talking about, for example, the SAICs and the Booz Allen Hamiltons of the world, we're talking about the Disneys, the Salesforces, the Facebooks of the world, the various companies that use intelligence. And in this case, very specifically, we're talking about security intelligence. That's the form that's probably most familiar to those with a background or familiarity with government intelligence. It's being used in very similar ways to that. So that excludes quite a lot from discussion. Things like competitive intelligence and market intelligence. Corporate espionage is an area that does overlap in some ways. Protecting against corporate espionage certainly falls within the remit of security intelligence, but actually conducting it tends to be really someone else's purview. And I think that's something Maria will be able to add a lot more to when we talk about kind of the way we share intelligence in the field and the cooperative nature of the field. So hopefully that kind of clears up what we're talking about, that it's, it's a very specific definition.
Thank you very much, Lewis, and thank you, Michael. Thank you to Johns Hopkins for having us here. I'd love to build off what Lewis has mentioned. Can you hear me all right? So as Lewis mentioned, there's this important distinction between government outsourcing and private sector intelligence being mostly focused on security and geopolitical risk. And then there's also the distinction between that and competitive intelligence. And as Lewis indicated, one of the key contrasts that we see there, one of the reasons that these two functions are separate, despite potential overlap in elements of intelligence tradecraft, is competitive intelligence professionals are collecting on each other's organizations, each other's employers, legally and openly and with regulations, but still on each other, whereas private sector intelligence professionals are collecting on the threat environment. They're collecting on potential vulnerabilities, threats, risks to their organizations, potentially opportunities as well, but it's very much focused, as Lewis said, predominantly around security and potentially political, geopolitical, environmental factors. Now, we do see some elements, there's substantial variation in the field, so we do see insider threat programs and other elements that are internal to the company, but it's not about other companies. And if anything, companies are cooperating when it comes to risks that they've experienced or they're anticipating that could affect each other. So one of the most robust examples of this is the airline industry, where airlines within the United States and internationally, European airlines, Asian airlines, all global airlines are cooperating, some of them quite closely, to identify common threats and vulnerabilities and risks and to mitigate together. And there's this common phrase of, there's no competition in security. So this holds true for security professionals and holds true for private sector intelligence professionals as well.
I'd probably just add to that as well. It's something that I found in particular with British intelligence studies, people do struggle to grasp a little bit. People have that same reaction when I say I'm studying private sector intelligence. They think I'm talking about either government consulting or corporate espionage. And something really stuck out to me, and myself, Maria, and another academic in this field were discussing this a while back. And something from, I think it was Olson's book, To Catch a Spy, where he said, there may be friendly countries, but there are no friendly intelligence services. In the private sector, you can almost flip that on its head. There are companies that can be very unfriendly. They can have very aggressive corporate rivalries with one another. But by and large, there aren't many unfriendly intelligence teams. I can call up my company's closest commercial competitors and talk on a first name basis with their intelligence teams pretty openly. Now, we still hold back on things that are of a corporate sensitive nature, but largely it's very cooperative. And I think that comes down to what Maria was saying before, that we're dealing with a very external threat environment. We're not focused on one another, we're focused on common threats. Is this country going to descend into civil war in the next few months? Do we need to evacuate? And can we work together to ensure a safe and speedy evacuation? It's things like that that I think really foster that cooperation.
And to build on that point, in 2019, I conducted a survey about sources of intelligence and how intelligence professionals in the private sector were doing their jobs. And one of the sets of questions I had was around crises and asking respondents in a recent crisis, whether it was the unrest in Latin America. That was one that I was focusing on. There were a few others as well. I ran a later one where I asked about the pandemic also. What were your most valuable sources? And one of the top ones was always other companies. It was other private sector intelligence professionals at other companies. So again, we mentioned this, sorry, Lewis, in terms of the cooperative dynamic, which really does define this field and makes it distinct from other types of intelligence that are focused on competitors.
Yeah, no, that's certainly reflective of my experiences. And I think, Maria, you and I actually met in an intelligence sharing group in the private sector. So I think that's, that's very reflective of the way it works. And a lot of that happens by accident. I think there's a lot of these groups pop up kind of ad hoc. And then there's, I know, Maria, your research goes deep into this, the kind of government sponsored programs to foster that kind of cooperation. So it's really partly by accident, but partly by design that it is that way.
Absolutely. And one of the most prominent examples, one that's held up in the profession or in the field as sometimes the quote unquote gold standard, is the Overseas Security Advisory Council run by the State Department, which is unparalleled in its power of connecting companies, connecting security and intelligence professionals in corporations that are not just within the US, but Royal Dutch Shell, Lufthansa, other companies that have a presence in the United States. When I was working for a Canadian energy company, I was able to be part of OSAC as well. And part of the power of OSAC is not just sharing from the government to the private sector, but facilitating those networks across private sector intelligence professionals who are focused on mutual interests in mitigating risk. And again, going back to the protests in Latin America a few years ago, where we observed roadblocks, inability to get to airports, various unrest. One of the best steps that OSAC took to help support its mission of supporting the private sector was to connect private sector intelligence professionals with each other on the ground and security professionals with each other on the ground, providing instant communication channels where they could bounce impressions off each other of, are your employees able to get out down this road? We're hearing reports that the airlines are canceling flights. Is this accurate? And then the airlines themselves would weigh in and say, no, this isn't accurate. So all of that was essential for protecting life, protecting assets on the ground, and it was facilitated by the government, but the whole power of it was to connect not just public-private, but private-private as well.
I think that's something that certainly in the UK academic space we do struggle with a little bit. I think our definition of intelligence are very firmly rooted in on one hand, secrecy. It has to be secret. If it's not secret, it's not intelligence. And on the other hand, it's government-based. It has to be inside government. And I know, Maria, you've presented, I think, at Cambridge recently and encountered some of that. I wouldn't call it hostility, but resistance to the concept of this really being intelligence. I think that's really bound up in those definitions. And I think that's where part of the challenge comes in. And I think that's one side of it. I think the other side of it is that this is a field that, as you touched on in your recent article, Maria, is still very much professionalizing. It's still a field that, even though we have so much cooperation between companies, it's very common for opposite numbers in different companies to have jobs that look nothing alike, to have job titles that look nothing alike. So it's very strange. It's almost like if you had rival law firms that would talk to each other all the time, but at the same time, their jobs are just completely unrecognizable in some cases to one another. There's often a degree of familiarity. You can generally figure out when someone's doing a similar job to you, but there are other times where you can be talking for a surprisingly long time with someone and then suddenly realize you're talking about completely different types of work. So it's really depends on the type of organization. I think there's probably a lot we can talk about there about what those different roles look like.
Absolutely. And on the job titles, this is something that I'm quite passionate about because it affects students attempting to enter into this space. It affects attracting talent and hiring. So in the 2019 survey I mentioned earlier, I had 126 respondents, and this was across the wide field of private sector intelligence. And I asked a question that was not supposed to be the most interesting finding in the survey, but ended up being so, of what is your job title? And out of those 126 responses, I had 99 answers. And so this level of variation is abnormal. This is not what we would observe in a codified profession such as law or in medicine, where there is variation. However, those professions have commonly recognized job titles that span across companies. If you're looking at a general counsel in a tech company or in an energy company, you would expect to see similar types of terms appear, and that is not the case in private sector intelligence. So ultimately, what happens if you try to plug in these terms into a search function such as Zippia? I did this recently. I had 29,000 jobs come back to me from Zippia of intelligence analyst in the private sector or intelligence analysis, and they were all over the map. There was a Lush Cosmetics consumer pricing analyst that popped up as part of this. It was about 1 in 12 that I could find that actually did refer to what I was looking for. So this is a challenge for breaking into this field, and it's a challenge for hiring, for benchmarking, for HR attempting to determine the standards. Currently, private sector intelligence is growing enormously in the past few years in the private sector, but it's not standardized and it's being set by corporate history and internal regulations and not by a profession of private sector intelligence.
I can only really mirror that. So in my own fieldwork last year, out of 76 respondents who answered this specific question about what is their job title, and I went into this exactly like Maria, expecting this to be an administrative part of the questionnaire, and came back and was wowed by the fact that I got 62 distinct job titles. So really replicated that view of the field. Within companies, it can get very challenging too. We're a department we're a type of job that most people don't know exists. And even within our own companies, it's something that I think the literature often gets wrong about us. There's a lot of literature on private sector intelligence that has this view that it's this kind of shady field designed to act in dangerous ways in the corporate interest. And often it presupposes a degree of internal cohesion that just doesn't exist. Most of my colleagues in my company are actually quite surprised to hear what I do and that this field exists, especially when they then subsequently hear that we're very transparent and anyone can read any of our reports and we don't classify things. That's always something that I think really catches people off guard. What complicates things even more is certain companies, they will have intelligence functions that are completely unrelated to security, things like market intelligence. We have a data platform that has the word intelligence in its title, and as a result, people often think I'm from that team. So it's a very, very messy landscape, and it's very challenging. And then, like I say, and I think Maria, I think you've got some data to show on this, that even talking amongst industry professionals, it's very difficult to determine who are doing the same things, because there's often fields where the type of work and the areas of focus are so radically different, but there's often that just common area of overlap that ends up putting us in the same room. So I don't know if Maria, if you want to maybe share that slide.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lewis. So we have many different functions and words on this slide, and that's probably the point of this slide, that, as Lewis is saying, this is not a neat area where we can clearly identify or anticipate what functions are going to fall in people's roles. This is from a second survey I conducted in 2020, which had 96 responses. And in this, I had respondents select which functions fell within their areas of responsibility. And often it's not even that clear cut. Often, as Lewis alluded to, the rest of the company doesn't necessarily understand the capacity that intelligence is providing, and doesn't always know what to do with a function. And sometimes individuals will be hired from the government into the private sector and asked, we know we need this, so please build it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those who've given you the buy-in know or expect what it's going to look like. And sometimes I had a couple of respondents inadvertently answer this question twice and gave me slightly different answers. And I don't think that their jobs had officially changed in the weeks between their two responses. I think that often this isn't very clearly defined because it's such an amorphous field that's still evolving. But quickly to run through what you can see here, the most common functions were geopolitical risk analysis, so 86%, and threat and vulnerability assessments. This is really core to what most of these teams are doing. It goes back to protecting people and assets and operations. Although the geopolitical risk analysis is actually higher than I anticipated, this does show it's not just a tactical security function. It's not just an element of law enforcement investigations, for example, within companies. It's much bigger than that. It's bigger picture environmental understanding or operational environment understanding. And then we see crisis management, travel security, and risk to assets or facilities still in the top 5, but diminishing there. And then you can see various other elements of physical security risk analysis, making recommendations. This one is controversial. Those of you who are familiar with government intelligence, this is a no-no in the intelligence community. This is not something in the US intelligence community that intelligence professionals are doing, is actually making recommendations. And this number is surprisingly high to me because I've interviewed many people, and I experienced this when I was a practitioner myself, who do not make recommendations. You provide to the executive perhaps implications of potential actions, but don't actually provide recommendations of what they should do. And then we see more internal to the company, insider threat and persons of interest investigations, and then executive protection, which is a big focus of many teams. And this one's also interesting because this is often where teams originate. I've seen some companies realize there are threats against our CEO, or this other company had their CEO targeted or their executives targeted, or our executives are traveling to a high-risk country or high-risk region. We should really have a program in place to protect them. So some teams start with executive protection and then often build out from there. And then investigations, compliance, due diligence, business continuity, emergency preparedness. GSOC stands for Global Security Operations Center. This is increasingly common. If I ran this survey again in 2022, I suspect I might see a higher proportion here. Although GSOCs are quite varied in terms of whether they're just a distribution center for information or whether they're actually providing more analytical support. And then at the bottom, we see cyber resilience and supply chain. And again, if I ran this survey today, I suspect this would be much, much higher. The survey If any of you are wondering where in 2022 or 2020, pardon me, this was, I launched in February, and some responses came in May and June, but the full implications of the pandemic, let alone Ukraine this year, I think will have changed the supply chain.
I definitely agree with that. My own study asked the same question, and mine was done in mid 2021, I believe. So pandemic response came a lot higher on the list. So I saw in the comments someone saying they were surprised to see supply chains at the bottom of the list. But, you know, that's exactly the case. It does tend to ebb and flow with certain things. One response that I got very surprisingly was everything. We're responsible for just understanding everything. We're the eyes and ears of the company. Now, I think that's an over-exaggeration. I think there are a lot of things, you know, changes to legislation are clearly within the legal department or the compliance department. They're not something that would typically fall within this job, but I think it does probably describe that sentiment that a lot of people feel, that it's any threat that the company has to understand, any risk or challenge that I've certainly seen that change with my own role. We've gone from having a very immediate focus of having an intelligence team that is looking at direct threats to the company that are manifesting right now or in the very near future, to this new team we've created that I now sit in, this strategic intelligence team that looks at very long-term, very strategic geopolitical threats that may bring second, third order impacts for the company. So even if the company has no footprint in, say, a conflict zone, we look at, well, what would increased refugee flows into other parts of the world mean? What would energy security look like in this environment? And how would that touch the company? And who do we need to kind of warn? And to Maria's point about giving direction and guidance, that's something I heard a lot during my interviews with practitioners, you know, coming from a government background where it's very much, you know, we don't set policy, we simply make, you know, we just kind of spell out how we see the world. And it's up to the policymaker to decide what they want to do with that. In the private sector, our policymakers, our stakeholders, they are not trained in receiving intelligence. They're not used to operating in this kind of environment. Very often, they're dealing with very unprecedented crises for them. So they're looking to you as the expert to say, well, what should we do about this? And I think that can catch a lot of people off guard, especially coming from that government background.
Let me interject with a few questions now, and let me remind our guests too that you can put your questions either in the Q&A or the chat function, and we'll be getting to those quickly. But Oliver, one thing, you know, when you talk about this topic, a lot of people, I think, have the impression that corporate intelligence really got a big boost after 9/11. And is this something that would you agree with, or or has this been really under the surface in corporate life for a lot longer than that? What would you say?
That's one of my favorite questions. I actually spoke.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah.
I've lectured Michael on this a few times. I think it's a topic that I think a lot of people get wrong, including practitioners. Actually, I asked this question to practitioners. You know, when do you think this field existed? And I believe the most common answer, without looking at my data, was after 9/11, and then a few people kind of said after the Cold War. Very few people had this kind of long history view of the field. So that prompted me to do a little bit of digging to find out where did this really come from. And what I really found was that it's a very difficult question to answer, to the point where I actually believe private sector intelligence predates government intelligence. There are examples going way back to, you know, Aztec spy merchant guild and German industrialists in the 14th century who ran vast spying networks to gain one up on their rivals. I won't go into too much detail on that one. I spoke recently to Lawfare on a pretty lengthy podcast where I went into some of the history. For anyone who really needs help sleeping, that's one to look into. But to answer your question there, Michael, I mean, I think what you said is absolutely right. I think after 9/11, the field certainly took off in a much bigger way. I think it became a much more standardized piece of the corporate toolkit. But there were certain companies out there, and I would describe them very much as outliers, that were doing this much earlier than that. There were vendors selling intelligence to the private sector, you know, post World War II and you know, for quite a long period of the 20th century. So it really depends on where you're looking. But I think your observation that it grew after 9/11 is absolutely correct. And I think we're actually in another one of those expansion waves now. I think 9/11 was one. I think the kind of Islamic States, Paris attacks, that kind of environment was another. I think COVID was just kickstarted probably the biggest expansion wave I've certainly seen in my career. And I think then the civil unrest in the US following that so shortly, I think that really compounded the effects of it. And I think now the war in Ukraine will only have solidified this kind of desire among corporate executives to have someone who can help them navigate geopolitical developments, to have someone who can help them figure out what's going on, what does this really mean for us. And I think the problem is I often describe my job as I read the news to executives. I tell them what's in the news all day, but really there's a little bit more to it than that. Is they can watch CNN, they can watch the BBC, but that's not necessarily going to tell them the kind of, what does this mean for my company? Is this thing geopolitically interesting, or is it my company interesting? And that's where our job comes in, is to look at these events and say, this is geopolitically really interesting, but it doesn't touch us, so we don't really need to worry about that. Whereas this problem is less geopolitically interesting, but actually it has a huge implication for us. So what does that really mean for us, and how do we start mitigating that?
And if I may jump in.
Listen, I want to interrupt you a second, Marie. I'm going to give you a chance on this one, because you said you got some pushback when you were talking about corporate intelligence, I think, and that there was some objection to the use of intelligence in this context. Now, I thought this gets back to the question of collection. So what, in terms of corporate intelligence, are we doing on collection? And how would you see that? And is that really the crux of the matter for professionals in government? That they don't see this as really proprietary. They don't see it as that, it's not secret. What would you, and how is corporate intelligence using collection these days?
I can jump in on that one. I asked a lot of questions around the intelligence cycle when I was speaking to practitioners, and one of them was, how do you go about doing collection? And what I found was pretty much every option is on the table. Now, there's a lot of creativity in the private sector simply because we don't always have the same toolkits government have available to them. It's a lot more open source heavy, but it's not exclusively so. And I think that's where a lot of that misconception comes from. I think people see the private sector and go, they are just reading the news, they're just doing OSINT, so how could that really be intelligence? And I think there's two things wrong with that. I think one, there's a whole debate we can have around whether OSINT is really intelligence, but even that would be incorrect. There's so many different collection methods taking place in the private sector. And I think part of that is, and it coincides with your point about this post 9/11 emergence of the field, or expansion of the field, is that we're seeing this democratization of collection methods. I can buy satellite imagery of a scale and resolution that would have only been available to superpower intelligence agencies during the Cold War. I can now buy that with my corporate Amex. I can go to an intelligence firm like Black Cube, for example, who have a long history, a very controversial history of doing human intelligence work, of putting covert sources in various places. There are many examples of energy companies putting human sources inside activist groups, such as Greenpeace. There's some really interesting stories in that world, in fact. When you look at SIGINT type collection or covert devices, you've got things like Pegasus, which has emerged in the private sector. Although its clients were purely in the government space, that technology has emerged in the private sector. It was only Israel's robust export controls that kept it off of the free market and kept it limited to certain governments. But how long until we see that kind of technology just emerging on the unregulated market? So I think any collection method that is really within reach is being used by the private sector, and more of these methods are coming into reach each year. So I think that's where a bit of the disconnect comes from, that people immediately assume that because it's so heavily reliant on OSINT, that therefore it's only doing OSINT. So I think that's probably, and then to Maria's earlier point about the intelligence sharing groups, there's a lot of human intelligence that goes on there. Now, it's not necessarily covert, it's not necessarily the kind of sexy spy stuff that we would imagine in government intelligence. It's just talking to people, it's reaching out to academic contacts, it's reaching out to local leaders and people that we can just talk to get a feel of the situation. So there's a great degree of that goes on, and in many ways the access is actually better than government because we can actually travel to these places, whereas a government analyst has a much harder time doing that. So I think that changes things as well. Maria, I don't know if you've got anything you want to add on that.
And just a couple points. I agree with everything you said, Lewis. And on the human element of it, human, as Lewis has alluded to, is a critical collection tool for private sector professionals. However, of course, the legal and ethical frameworks are different around what's permissible if you work at the CIA or what's permissible if you work at a bank or an airline. However, what I wanted to add on the human side, Lewis has listed several really, really important sources, whether it's peers in other companies or vendor reports or public sector partners who often are sharing unclassified information. So OSAC, which I gave the example earlier, their analysts have clearances. However, what OSAC is sharing is open information. So many examples like that. But the one that I wanted to add to Lewis's list is company employees. It's your own employees who live in, for example, rural areas in which your other sources might not actually have that much visibility, who have family members or friends who are telling them about their experiences, especially in a civil unrest situation or some sort of impending civil war. This is what I observed when I was working in the energy sector when the civil war was breaking out in Yemen. And one of the most valuable sources of information for me was colleagues who were Yemeni or had friends who were Yemeni or had some sort of connection on the ground. And I observed this also in my research when I asked professionals about their most valuable sources, and local employees on the ground was always in the top 5, if not the top 3.
Yeah, that's a great call out. I think local security managers in particular, they always have their various drinking clubs that tend to operate like vast human intelligence networks, and they tend to hear things far before any of the vendors and often any of the government sources do. So I think that's a really good call out. And then one final point I'll add is some of the practitioners I spoke to in certain sectors, their companies are building SCIFs or they have access to government SCIFs and they do consume classified information. That's very sectorally specific, mainly places like airlines, but it does happen.
Maria, I'd like you to address the question of professionalization of the the corporate intelligence field, because that's something that I know you've written about. You're interested in that, and it gets back to your the slide that you showed, which was there's so many different functions. There's such a big remit for a lot of different offices on what they want an analyst to do. It's hard to almost say, well, how do you professionalize that? So where do you see this going? Is this something that's been are we seeing more standards developing, and elaborate on that for a minute?
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael, for the question. This is, again, one of my passions when it comes to this field. It also allows me to touch back on what Lewis was saying with the history. And I wanted to address something that I saw in the chat regarding Jane's predating 9/11, which is absolutely, to my knowledge, true and is true of many vendors. So I want to draw the distinction between private sector consultancies or vendors or service providers, whichever terminology that we use, and in-house intelligence, which is really what we're looking at in terms of the modern profession. It's both, it encompasses both, but the real shift that's been quite recent and is nascent and evolving is the in-house intelligence teams. So many of them were built out of corporate security teams. Many of these companies have had security functions much longer, and then the security functions started to build out analysis. So my own position as a officially security analyst, but really intelligence analyst, was because my boss was given a security team, looked at it and said, we're missing a piece here. We need intelligence as part of this picture. So that's part of the evolution. And I've mapped this on, as Michael's alluding to the literature on intelligence professionalization, which is traditionally focused on national security or government intelligence. And I've added in private sector intelligence. So what you see here is that professionalization is a spectrum. It isn't a dichotomy. It isn't, is this a profession, yes or no? It's how professionalized is it? And on the right side here, we see medicine and law, which are codified. They have licensing and certification. There are recognized degree programs at universities in this. There's a whole common progression that we're all familiar with. And we all have heard of things like the Hippocratic Oath, the idea that there are codified ethics and standards. And then on the other end, we see a craft or a guild. And this is drawn from work by Stephen Marin and others looking at primarily government intelligence, arguing that this is closer to the guild or craft framework in which information is handed from a master to an apprentice. Knowledge is shared orally, it's shared by individuals through benchmarking and best practice sharing, but it's not actually codified, and it's not a body of knowledge that's developed and changing over time. So government intelligence has been moving along this spectrum. I have it here just behind journalism. There are no units on this. This isn't carefully measured. This is qualitative analysis, but it's along the way, and it's ahead of private sector intelligence, which is following in its footsteps. And in terms of what appears in codified professions, I've identified 5 categories, and then in my research, I was mapping out private sector intelligence as to where it falls here. So the first is a shared identity, and Lewis talked about this at the outset, that there is a shared identity, even though there's substantial variation, even though none of our jobs might look exactly the same. And there's some debates over, is insider threat part of this, yes or no, or other elements like that. But there is this
Just
common
Maria,
identity.
I would just jump in there. I see we actually have Deline Duvenage in the chat, who has done a fantastic PhD on the identity of professionals in this field. So there's a whole wealth that you can go into there with her research.
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. And hello, Deline, and encourage everybody to look at Dr. Duvenage's research. It's very, very good, especially as Lewis said on the shared identity piece. The second one is the body of knowledge. So as Lewis alluded to, there is literature that purports to talk about private sector intelligence, but really quite often this is about corporate espionage. It's about government outsourcing, competitive intelligence. So there is a very, very small literature of which Deline Duvenage's work is one example, one prominent, one of the few existing pieces of knowledge in this space, but this is gradually growing. And then
I think you could probably say between Michael, yourself, Deline, I think about 50% of the contributors to the literature in this field are probably on this call right now, which really describes quite how small it is.
It is certainly. There's also a book by Justin Crump, Corporate Security Intelligence, which is another. It's the only book that I'm aware of that really does specifically talk about this field. And most of this literature has emerged in the past 10 to 12 years, if that. The third pillar is training and education. And so we're all here at the behest of and thanks to Johns Hopkins, which is one of the few institutions that has some awareness of private sector intelligence in the its educational offerings. And I won't put Dr. Ard on the spot in terms of whether we'll see that grow over time, but I think that would be wonderful to see. But we do see training courses that have emerged.
Maria, I think we lost you for a sec. Maria was having some trouble with the headphone earlier. So what I'd like to do at the moment, sorry about that, Maria, but there's some questions in the chat, and we want to get to those, and Maria will rejoin us here. Okay, so one question: what are your thoughts on intelligence being decision support, and thus it being only for the leadership and not any decision maker at any level?
That's a really interesting question. I would say, I mean, for me, I consider intelligence to be all about decision advantage, to quote Sims. You know, I think this is it's very core to what it's about. I don't necessarily think it has to be just for the leadership. Within my own company, we send a product out to 1,600 of our top executives every week. So, you know, leaders at all levels of the company. So I think it really depends. And I think any leader within any functional part of an organization can really benefit from having access to better ideas of what's going on, what's impacting their various business units. I think to come back to the point earlier about us sometimes offering advice in a big corporation, that can be quite challenging, because I've been with my company for 3 years now, and I don't fully understand all the different parts of it. There are whole divisions that I regularly discover exist that I had no idea about. So I rely a lot on those functional experts, those leaders of those business units, to really interpret the advice we're giving, or at least to interpret the kind of, you know, here's a problem that we see. Please tell us whether you think this will impact your side of the business and what you need to do about it. But I think that's a really important point.
When Salida asked, I'd be interested in knowing the difference between threat and vulnerability versus cyber risk and threat. Perhaps we can address this as there's another way to address it. It might just be, what are we when we talk about in corporate intelligence, we talk about threat and we talk about risk, and they're different ideas. So maybe that's one way to address that question.
I think there's also, without knowing the specifics of Maria's responses there on how that was, if it was coded in any way, but, I think one area that probably makes it a little bit foggier is that there is the cyber side of things as well, which in many companies is a completely distinct intelligence team. Some have fusion teams, but that's pretty rare in my opinion. It seems to be more common that they're separate. And as a result, they have very different types of language than we would have. Some companies will use vulnerability in the place of threat, the language, and I think really it comes back to that professionalization piece. It's very messy. It's very dependent on which company, how developed they are, how mature their intelligence program is. In some, you'll have very formalized risk matrices. You'll have very formalized language of intelligence probability. You'll have very clear definitions of what these things mean. In others, they get used very haphazardly. So, Maria, I don't know if your sound's back because I don't want to talk to your data here, but that's certainly been my impression of it.
Yes, I've been able to hear you loud and clear since just after Michael took over again. Sorry about that. My headset and Zoom are not playing very nicely together today. So if it persists, I'll just take this off. Yeah, in terms of risk and threats, so as Michael referred to, there are distinct definitions. And so the threats exist out there, the risks are specific to the company. There's that element of what does it mean for us, which is one of the key value adds that any Intel professional is providing within their company. In terms of cyber, I concur with everything Lewis just said, which I did hear about the fusion model existing, but not being that common. I've seen some corporations experimenting with that recently, particularly in the financial sector. But what seems to be the most effective model is having distinct units. So having a distinct cyber intelligence unit, but talking very closely to them, working with them. One airline told me that their cyber and physical security intelligence teams had never co-authored before until the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, they discovered how to collaborate and they started producing joint products. And in my experience, that's one of the most effective ways you can do it, is having your own areas of expertise and focuses, but working very closely together. And so another critical piece of that for that to work is that you have to be able to speak the same language. So the cyber intelligence teams that I've seen that are most effective have strategically minded individuals. Maybe they have some geopolitical experience, but they're willing to divide the responsibilities and not try to do what the security intelligence team or the geopolitical intelligence team is doing, but to complement it.
Another question is, how do intelligence professionals in the private sector consider economic factors in analysis? Was that your experience too, that you were called upon to do that as well?
I'm certainly finding that in my current role. Probably one of the most common components of any of my briefings now is we need a chief economist for the company because I'm not qualified to be doing this. I certainly struggle a lot with specific large scale economic analysis, but it does factor in on security concerns, it does factor in on the kind of strategic issues that we're interested in. So it's pretty hard to ignore. And even when I was working on much more tactical problems, in a former role, it was still a function. If a country's economy is suffering, you're going to start seeing things like crime and civil unrest start to rise. So it's something we definitely do pay attention to.
Although I would add that in some companies, there are distinct teams that do that. So you run into potentially silos or at least just consciousness of whose turf is whose. So I've seen this with, for example, government affairs teams that have an economic element or an economic team that is entirely distinct from a security team. So there are different models out there. I think what Lewis is describing is one of the optimal models where you actually are able to do both. Although, Lewis, you alluded to the idea of wanting to bring on an economist specifically to support in this respect. So I think the overarching principle I've seen for what seems to work best is having expertise in different areas as opposed to having one person or even a couple of people who are interchangeable and saying, do it all, instead having these defined roles in these areas of specialization, but close collaboration.
Often our role is that if we don't know the answer to something, it's to just go find someone who can give us the answer to it. So often we are just sniffing out those economically minded people and getting their view on things.
And by the way, I want to just commend everyone on the great dialogue that's going on in the chat. It's wish I could be focusing on it more, but really appreciate the engagement of the audience in this great topic. There's a few other questions. Griff asked, are there proportionality studies on external state actors like Russia or China on their threats to private sector or corporate espionage?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question there, if I'm honest.
Okay. I mean, what are we seeing in terms of how other state actors may be impacting on the corporate world, multinational corporations, et cetera? We haven't, I think one of the things I just was hearing from somebody yesterday that we expected to see a lot more disruption perhaps from say Russia due to the war in Ukraine on corporate activities than we have. And perhaps that's a way of answering it.
I mean, that's really, I would say, one of the core functions of the job is to understand those kind of threats. And we can look at that in all sorts of unique ways, whether it's corporate espionage of IP, whether a country's government is trying to steal the company's secrets, and that's certainly something that I spend a lot of my time focusing on, and that we have insider risk teams that are very dedicated to stopping data exfiltration and things like that, through to very specific threats. So I'll give you an example. That's one that I've been very concerned about over the last year is subsea internet cable targeting by the Russians. It's a capability that we know they have. It's something that's pretty easy to do, having spoken to a few companies. I even met a company that had a subsea security team, which I thought was probably one of the coolest job titles in the field. And they've kind of corroborated how easy this is to do, and it's a real kind of economic pain point for the West. So my big concern working for a cloud computing company is, well, what does that mean if that kind of targeting happens, if something on that scale were to happen? So there are certain risks that I would say are quite unique to certain adversarial nations that we have to be very mindful of. Others are probably a bit more broad, where we can just be caught in the crossfire. To give you an example, Sweden banned Huawei from being involved in their 5G program. And in response, China essentially kicked Ericsson, a large Swedish telecoms company, out of the country, and China was a key market for them. So Ericsson had nothing to do, as far as I can tell, with that decision to exclude Huawei, but they were just a political ball to be kicked around. So you do see a lot of that, companies getting caught in the crossfire because of their national affiliation. So rather than it being a specific threat to the company from a country, it's one country against another that a company gets caught in the middle of.
And something else just to add on the Russia and cyber side of things is, this is something we were watching quite closely from the Intelligence Project, was the potential for cascading effects or cyber attacks directly on corporations from Russia at the start of the conflict. And Michael, as you alluded to, I believe we didn't see as much of that as had been anticipated. And we did see the CISA alerts here and public-private partnerships to help companies discuss, and certainly Lewis and I were both seeing on the private sector side, robust conversations about protection and mitigation. So what happened with cyber attacks in the war could be a whole conversation on its own, but a point I wanted to make, which is broader than just that case study, is it is very challenging to identify the goals that didn't go in the net. It's challenging being the goalie. And so part of the challenge for intelligence teams is proving value. And then if you do your job effectively and you mitigate the risk, then the risk doesn't materialize and there's no tangible evidence. And it can often be hard to triangulate, isolate the variables to determine, was it because we anticipated and mitigated, or were there a whole host of factors? So that's a challenge for intelligence in government as well as private. But particularly we see this in the private sector side with teams proving value and building out the role. But Lewis is one of the rare cases in which he can actually point to intelligence that got it exactly right and the executives knew it, and then were able to act accordingly and knew that intelligence had actually affected it. But in terms of the cyber attacks, there was a lot of proactive mitigation going on, and that has to be part of the story, but it's always very challenging to determine exactly why you didn't see things explode.
Let's get to a few more questions. We've got about 10 minutes more in our program. We have a hard stop today on the hour, but thanks for these great questions and such a lively discussion from our panelists. Barbara asked about the influx of government intelligence professionals after 9/11 into corporate intelligence. And has that impacted private sector professionalization? And also, but I'd like to also add another question onto that, which was something we discussed earlier. Does that mean that it's very difficult for people without that experience in government to get into this field?
That's a great question. I think that's a data point that I probably quote Maria on more than anything else. But before I let her talk on that point, because I know she's got some fantastic data, specifically how many people from the public sector are moving into private, I think that's something that is probably changing. I've certainly noticed that I joined from the military, and that was very much the norm, that it was very difficult to get a job in this field unless you had government, military, law enforcement type background or very advanced academic credentials. I think that's changing now. I think the field is looking more to academia. I think they've realized that you don't have to have carried a gun at some point in your life to do this job. And I think they're starting to also suffer from a bit of a choke point in the number of professionals that could be delivered by governments each year. Coming from the UK, Afghanistan and Iraq wound down. The idea of every year producing a new crop of qualified intelligence officers out of the army is really over now. There's much fewer people leaving the service because the services are so much smaller and the scale of operations are so much smaller, but demand is higher than ever in the field. So that personnel, that talent has to come from somewhere. So I think a lot of academic backgrounds are starting to be drawn on for this. And often you meet people in this field that have all sorts of really eclectic backgrounds, journalists. And I think we've spoken to someone recently, Maria, who's I want to say came from an executive assistant background and just kind of fell into this world. So you meet all sorts of really interesting people that can bring a lot to the table. And like I said, I know Maria's got a lot of data on this point.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lewis. One of the data points Lewis is alluding to right up front is that for my survey research, it's just over half of individuals in this space who responded to my survey had a government background. It was 57% approximately, I believe, without my data right in front of me. And there is this trend towards, as Lewis said, more diverse backgrounds. What I found when I tested of years of experience, whether people had those backgrounds, was it wasn't that clear-cut a story. Those who had been in the field for 5 years, or for more than 5 years, versus those who'd come in the past 5 years in my data didn't have a statistically significant difference in whether or not they had the government background. It was pretty consistent that it was over half. But as Lewis alluded to, it used to be more of a prerequisite. And I had many interviewees who indicated back in the 1990s, it would have been pretty much unheard of. I did find 1 or 2 people in my survey who had been in who'd never served in government, who had been around for a couple of decades, but it's very, very unusual. There are some examples of people working their way up in corporate roles. So one of the most prominent members of the field now worked her way up, I believe, from a bank teller up to running the security intelligence program at the bank. There are those stories, and there are many, particularly on the analytical side, who come from grad school into the private sector, and there are managers who are increasingly hiring for that and saying, in some cases, I don't want anyone with a government background because I don't want a carbon copy of government tradecraft. I want to be able to mold my analysts specific to the company's needs and to how we do intelligence in the private sector. So there are different mindsets on that. There are many who are looking for diverse backgrounds. So recognizing that a mix is most effective, having some who have government, whether it's intelligence community, military, law enforcement experience, and some who do not, and then having that blended team with diverse backgrounds. The other data points I want to mention on that were where the public sector background really comes into play is hiring. It's getting in the door. And when I asked my survey respondents, how did you get your job? The personal network was 48%. It was the highest by far compared to job postings, which was somewhere in the 30% range, I believe. And then there were other mechanisms of entry that were even lower. So personal network was top and then job postings. But when I divided the respondents by whether or not they'd worked in the government, the story was starkly different. And those who had were much more likely to have gotten in through a job posting, and those who had not were very unlikely to have gotten in just by applying. they usually knew somebody. So that's, again, part of this challenge of getting in the door. But as Lewis said, it is changing.
I see there's a comment there about ARIP from Deline, I believe. And I'd say, especially, I imagine there are people in this audience who are probably wondering, how do I get in that door? I would say organizations like ARIP, the Association of Risk Intelligence Professionals, Association of International Risk Intelligence Professionals, those kind of groups are key for forging those networks. It's a very trust-based sector. It's one that I think requires, to a great degree, as Maria's data shows, that kind of personal networking, and that can be a little bit hard to do from the outside. So joining those kind of groups, attending the events, and getting your name out there, I think is a really important step in joining the field.
Absolutely, and thank you, Deline, for bringing up ARIP. ARIP was founded in 2015. It is quite new, and its mission is to professionalize private sector intelligence, and it's moved the field already along this path, including making it easier for people without a government background, perhaps students or recent graduates, to find out about it and determine what skills they need to succeed.
Finally, I'm trying to synthesize some questions here. We have a few minutes left, but one of our topics near and dear to our hearts is this interaction between the private and public intelligence and sharing, right? Because how government is able to leverage all the talent and expertise and insight that is going on in the corporate world into sort of global security problems. Are we seeing this divide, and I'm going to call it a divide, being bridged more these days because information is becoming a lot more accessible, and the governments are seeing what they're missing from a lot of this and may be able to tap into what's going on in the corporate world?
I'll speak very quickly to this, but Lewis, I think you have an excellent example of this in practice. So I want to make sure you have time to give that example.
I didn't want to jump in because given the title of your PhD is public-private partnerships in the field, I kind of figured this would be your question.
Well, thank you. Yes, Michael, very quickly, there is a big shift in government partners or potential partners recognizing the value of collaborating with the private sector. And as Lewis alluded to, I wrote 307 pages on this topic. I won't subject you to all of them in 2 minutes, but there are some government entities that do this more effectively than others. And OSAC, as I mentioned within the State Department, is one of those examples. One of the reasons OSAC can be effective is that it is not sharing classified information. It is sharing open source. The analysts, again, are cleared, but they're sharing primarily open source. So primarily OSAC serves as a facilitator, an aggregator of information, a connector on a scale that the private sector can't quite do on their own. But there are other models on the more classified side. There are intelligence community entities, and I'm mostly familiar with the US, but my home country of Canada and other countries certainly are working on these models. The UK has some great models as well of recognizing the need to share. And what's critically important is being able to share with the knowledge that the information might go to foreigners, because the government partnerships are so often set up on US only, no foreign, and that is very limiting for intelligence teams that are supporting transnational or multinational corporate structures with employees potentially in their own teams who aren't their nationality. So that's one element that's really important. That's very, very challenging for the government. But I think many partnerships are recognizing the value of open source, and the most effective ones are the ones that recognize there's this in-house capacity, this intelligence and security capacity. It's not just talking to operators about their critical infrastructure vulnerabilities. It's sharing information about the threat landscape.
I think the only thing I would add to that is, yeah, there are some very specific examples out there of one story I've heard that I've not been able to confirm is that Disney's intelligence team came about because a US Special Forces team found blueprints of Disney parks in a cave in Afghanistan somewhere, and very quickly the FBI came to Disney and said, hey, you've got a problem, and the company's reaction was, well, we need to understand more about this, so we need an intelligence team, we need to beef up our security team. So there's a lot of specific examples like that in the field. And then the other side of it is I've come across some examples where governments have sought to learn from the private sector, especially on kind of new technologies and things like that. So post-Arab Spring, the ODNI sat down with a number of oil companies to understand, how did you get it so right and we got it so wrong? And the answer really was, well, we understood social media and we were using that as our primary collection method. And then from the other side of it was we were sharing intelligence with our peer companies. So I think there is a two-way dialogue going on there.
Well, very good. Everybody, thank you very much for this dialogue today. I think this was terrific, a really great discussion. We thank Maria and Louis for being with us today. We look forward to seeing more publications from you. Louis, good luck in your finishing up your PhD. And also thanks to everybody who joined us today, and the great dialogue in the chat. It really added a lot. We look forward to having a new Inside Intelligence in 2 weeks, where Atai Shapira from Israeli intelligence, retired colonel of Israeli intelligence, will talk to us about Israeli perspectives on strategic intelligence. So join us then on the 29th of June. For now, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you soon.